showing up. Hi, good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you are. I guess right now, no place is having early afternoon or late afternoon. I'm Zhu Chen, professor of finance at the University of Hong Kong, and also I'm the director of the Asia Global Institute here at Hong Kong U. First of all, welcome to this second webinar on quantitative history. So last week we started this sequence, and today we're very happy to have Professor Stylianos Michalopoulos from Brown University. As in the announcement, as the announcement mentioned, Professor Michalopoulos is an associate professor of economics at Brown, and he is a native of Greece. He went to college and also for a master's degree at the Athens University of Economics and Business. He got his PhD from Brown University in economics. To make a long story short, so throughout his career, he has visited several different places after studying at Tufts University as an assistant professor. Over the years, he has published a number of papers, on topics ranging from very ancient human history on the spreading of agriculture to now, the modern day impact of historical legacies in Sub-Saharan Africa and many other topics. He also received several awards or prizes. One is the 2015 Excellence Award in Global Economic Affairs from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy based in Germany. He also received the 2019 Bodasaki Prize in the field of social sciences for his wonderful contributions in different areas. So today he's going to talk about his new research on the impact of ancestral lifeways on modern day or contemporary economic achievements in Sub-Saharan Africa. So without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Michalopoulos.
Thank you very much, Zivu. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's my second time that I give a Zoom seminar. I find Zoom seminars surprisingly democratic in the sense you can start and log in from wherever you are and have some fun listening to topics. So today I'm about to share my screen, and I guess now you are all looking at the same thing. Today I would like to talk about basically, so this is joint work with Louis and David, colleagues of mine here at Brown, it's a topic that we have worked for quite some time now. So here are our thoughts put together. So now we start from the observation that, look, we have been, I'm very glad to be presenting in this series of seminars because it's really quantitatively thinking about how history has a bearing on economic performance today. And, let me just for the next few minutes, let me give you a preview of how this literature has moved, basically moving from the sterile world of economics and some modeling and some old approach of inertia. You have physical capital or human capital, and then depending on how far you start from the steady state, you may or may not converge quickly or not. So that the old approach where basically macroeconomists and growth economists would not meet historians. Then, guys started realizing that, look, there are some persistent forces out there that have a bearing on economic activity, on understanding variation in economic activity today. So they started thinking about, what are these persistent exogenous forces? We started thinking about geography. Okay, so still growth economies are not very close to economic historians. And at some point, let's say the last 20 years, it occurred to us that the development does not occur in vacuum. The development occurs is much squarely taking place within a social context, within a specific historical context, and this context may actually be very important than what we have thought, at least up to the early 2000s. So what is this new literature on persistence? Basically we take historical events a bit more seriously, and we try to figure out how they percolate, how they may still be relevant today, and try to figure out what are the channels via which these historical events are shaping contemporary outcomes. And the two dominant themes are either via cultural legacies or institutional legacies, or both. And so there are some papers out there that look either on the cultural side or on the political side of things. So the literature on persistence, has looked a great deal across countries, across countries of origins of groups. So like the English in the US, the Irish in the US, the Scottish in the US, across geographic regions or across ethnic homelands. Now, what are we doing in this paper? We're looking basically at individuals that belong to different ethnic groups within a given location. Our locations are going to be very small or very precise. Villages in rural Africa, or neighborhoods in urban cities, in urban locations. And we will be asking, some, a given question. Now, but let me, before telling you what exactly we ask, let me tell you how basically people have thought about tracing the role of history. You can think about history as existing in maps. So, villages, locations, kingdoms, and then you can start comparing basically economic activity next to one kingdom, or, as you cross the ethnic homeland of a group X to the ethnic homeland of group Y, and looking at how this may map into differences in economic performance. So, so then history is space specific. Then it's like a game of polygons, if you were to think of it as from a technical point of view. And this literature has flourished quite a bit. Why? Because it is relatively easy to find books that describe something that has happened, and at the end they have a map, and which actually allows for then quantitatively minded researchers to actually try to figure out what's going on inside and outside of this delineated area. Now, the second strand is thinking about history in terms of experiences of populations, in terms of basically lineages. Now, this also is very interesting. It's a bit less well developed, not because people do not think that these collective experiences at a lineage level are very important. They indeed are, but it's hard to, it's harder to quantify them. So it's harder to basically attach a history to a lineage, at least not as readily as one would like. So this is where our contribution in this paper is to basically look at history of lineages and how we will think about the history and what is the lineage in mind. Here's where we go. So it's Africa, our context, and our basically window of looking into the lineage of individuals is going to be the ethnic identity of a given respondent. Now you may ask yourself, hold on, why ethnicity and not some other, social cleavage? Well, let's see. We're in Africa, so this is now 2008, but I could have pulled even more recent data. They asked respondents, this Afrobarometer, about how comfortable they, what is their identity, whether they identify with the nation they live in, whether they identify with Kenya, they feel like more like Kenyan or more like Kikuyu, which would be one of the largest ethnic groups in Kenya. And you see here basically that roughly half of the respondents would be more comfortable, or at least as comfortable, identifying with their own ethnic group compared to the nation they live in. So this is just like to highlight that the social cleavage of ethnic identity is not something that is empirically important in the regressions that will follow, but is also something that is important in the social construct, in how people identify with the various social entities. Okay, so here's the research question. So the research question will be very familiar to you, but the context will be very different from the usual context where we ask this question. So we are going to ask the question how basically descendants of those that belong to groups that in the precolonial era they were more dependent on agriculture. How do these offspring basically compare to descendants of people that were doing not agriculture, let's say 100, 200 years ago. And so we're going to look at descendants of pastoralists, descendants of agriculturalists in the same contemporary setting in Lagos in Nigeria, or in rural places in different parts of Africa, and ask the question: is there any legacy? Is there any difference in the level of observable economic performance across these individuals? Now, why are we asking this question? You may say, well, there is a very big literature that kind of follows an evolutionary perspective in terms of social evolution. Like over time, people started from hunting and gathering societies. At some point, agriculture came along with pastoralism. Now, what is the distinctive difference between agriculture and pastoralism is mostly the nomadic lifestyle of pastoralists, and much less so for farmers. And then eventually farming basically came with civilization, came with basically state centralization, formation of nuclear families, or changes in the social arrangements, and eventually development. So in this continuum, basically, one ties the advent of agriculture to basically the rise of development. No, but in my description so far, this has been not in terms of people, it has been in terms of places. So many of the questions today that have been so far have been asked was mostly like asking, okay, now places in the world that moved earlier into agriculture, are they more developed today? So it was like a space specific question. Now we're asking the same question in the context of lineages of pastoralists versus lineages of farmers. Okay, so what are we going to find? We're going to find a very robust correlation, association that has the following form. Basically, wherever you observe farmers, not farmers, individuals that trace their ancestry to farming groups compared to individuals that trace their ancestry to pastoral groups, those of farming descent, they outperform those of pastoral descent. Then, of course, you may naturally ask, why is this relevant? Well, it is relevant for various reasons. One is to start thinking about, ethnic inequality, which at least from the point of view of a few of, policymakers or of individuals is an important dimension. You need to understand, this will allow us to understand the roots of ethnic inequality. And at the same time, you can ask, why? Why are you getting this pattern? This will be basically the half of my talk. We'll try to say, well, we don't have a hammer. You will not come out of this talk saying, look, now I am 100% convinced I know why groups of individuals with farmers' descent, with a farming descent are doing better than pastoral descent, but you will get quite a bit of suggestive evidence to form, to have better priors than I hope than what you start with now. So why Africa? We could have asked literally this question in many different parts of the world where you have a coexistence or of farmers and herders, or individuals that trace their ancestry to farmers versus ancestry to herders. Well, Sub-Saharan Africa has this nice setting that basically as early, not many decades ago, like as early as mid-19th century, you had a landscape where many different groups and many different modes of production basically coexisted. Farmers, pastoralists, hunters, gatherers, and fishing societies. And the good thing with these societies is that basically we actually have a pretty decent understanding, again, for the historical record, we have a rough, not decent, like a rough understanding of, the different types of economic activity that different groups were engaging as late as 19th century. And now the fact that then we observe these individuals today, we know their ethnic identity. This allows us basically to peep into their past and ask the question that we would like to ask, like, does ancestry to different lineages of different mode of production predict economic outcomes at the individual level? Okay, so a few things just to set the stage for what type of variation we have in pre-colonial Africa. So pre-colonial Africa, this is mid-19th century, and we have like a bunch of agricultural tribes, like the Tetela in Congo, the Bisa in Zambia, or the Mende in Sierra Leone. We have quite a few pastoral tribes, like the Samburu, the Maasai in Kenya, or the Afar in Ethiopia, but also societies dependent on fishing, like the Mbuti, on hunting, the Mbuti, or gathering, or these earlier forms of subsistence. So that you get an idea, this is now two things. The polygons that you see depict our best understanding of historical homelands of ethnic groups in Africa. This is basically the map of Murdoch from his book in 1959. Nathan Nunn digitized it for the first time in his work of slavery, and Elias and myself have basically used this map to ask various questions about the economic activity and ethnic groups in Africa. So here, what I'm showing you is the polygons, that is the homelands, and the different colors depict what ethnographers have put together regarding their mode of subsistence. As you can see here, there is quite a bit of variation with basically places that have, agricultural groups next to, groups that are doing very different, are engaged in very different modes of production. So the question that we will be asking is whether, living tracing your ancestry to different territories of different dependence on agriculture, what does it mean for your economic activity today? So this is now a map of dependence on pastoralism, and so the argument that will be is a usual argument that the argument that has been invoked to link contemporary economic performance to the rise of agriculture. It has this notion of the social evolution, that you start from hunting and gathering society, you move eventually to agriculture. The latter is a ground for really the birth of civilizations, for urban and industrial societies. So it's like this continuum that is like a starting point. If your starting point is higher than other modes of subsistence, in this continuum, agriculture is really the one closest to the rise of industry, then you would be the guy that would have an easier time exiting to the modern economy. And cross-country patterns are broadly consistent with this. With this idea. Now, pastoralism in this timeline is not exactly hunting and gathering. It's not exactly agriculture. It's something thought mostly in between, because pastoralism has this characteristic of moving societies, of basically not fixicity of basically a settlement. Now, you may ask yourself, fine, okay, now you're going to spend the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes telling me that no matter how you cut the data, you're going to find a very strong association between ancestry of agricultural guys tracing their ancestry to agricultural societies versus individuals in the same village, in the same neighborhood in Lagos or in Nairobi, tracing their ancestry to pastoral communities. Now, how you would like us to interpret this finding? Again, I'm going to basically show you what is not a smoking gun. So we can basically we'll take you through the series of potential explanations. and we'll end up saying that basically there are two channels for which we can find some positive evidence. That is, basically we will end up saying that those of agricultural descent, they seem to have some cultural traits that are different from those of pastoral descent, and I'm going to basically tell you why we think this is the case. And at the same time, there will be some contemporary evidence, some evidence that there is some element of political discrimination going on against those of pastoral descent. But I will basically go through the potential arguments one by one, or like a bundle by bundle, so that we can reach these conclusions. Okay, so here's a timeline. We'll go through the data, then I'll show you the key correlations. What's going to be striking is that this association is there. It's there no matter how you cut the data. And then I'm going to basically spend some time on the possible challenges. Okay, so what are we using? Demographic and health surveys in Africa. We have a pretty wide coverage, 21 sub-Saharan countries, 390 groups. These are groups in terms of ethnic identities in the DHS. So they ask respondents a bunch of questions, including the group they belong to. We have about 300,000 respondents. We're going to look at those between 15 and 64. We know where they are. And the sample basically goes, in some countries, there's like repeated surveys. In others, we have fewer surveys. We're going to basically link these 382 groups from the demographic and health surveys to 187 pre-colonial groups on Murdoch's list. Now, why is this necessary? This is exactly what will allow us to say that, look, Ibrahim surveyed in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia in 2010. He belongs to, he is he says that he belongs to the Somali ethnic group. Hence, we can actually link this guy to the how much his ancestors were depending on agriculture versus farming through the the ethnographic atlas information. Okay. Moreover, we have a bunch of other characteristics of these contemporary characteristics, including his religion, her religion and occupation, and where they are. So what is our outcome of interest? Well, we care about basically standards of living. So broadly defined, we're going to have two measures that capture relatively consistently standards of living across Africa. One is going to be level of education, a scale between 0 to 5. So think of it as like in the educational ladder from no education to incomplete secondary and so on. And then a variable that the demographic and health survey guys called household wealth. Now, don't get excited. This is not like account information or asset information. It is really the presence of some very basic utilities like access to electricity, access to drink water, what are the sources of drinking water, what are the sources for the sewage, and things like that. So some very basic things like whether you have a roof in your, how many rooms you have in your house, and things like that. Okay, and so it's like it's a country-specific variable. So, and it's a household level variable. So you can compare across households within the same country. So, okay, here's this map. It's giving you an idea of the distribution of villages or enumeration areas actually in the demographic and health surveys. And now let's go and look at the ethnographic atlas. So this ethnographic atlas has been a very key, set of, source of anthropological data, of ethnographic data that has really lent some credence to the work of those interested in linking the past to the present. Why? To the present. Why? Because this is a unique glimpse on literally unique glimpse on various characteristics of pre-industrial societies in the Asia and Africa in particular, where you can actually get some idea of their economic, social, and institutional structure just on the eve of the colonial era. Today, we're going to focus on the subsistence mode, and we're going to get back to these other characteristics in a few minutes. Okay, so now, how many of these individuals now are, as I told you, in the late early pre-colonial Africa, there was a diversity of modes of subsistence on the ground, at least as experienced, at least as recorded by the ethnographers of the time. Well, fast forward 150 years, what type, the guys that you survey, where do they trace their ancestry to? Well, most of the guys in our sample of 21 countries and about 300,000 individuals, they can trace to their ancestry to agricultural groups. This is 84%. About 7.5% would be pastoral groups, and another 7 and 8.8% would be mixed agriculture and pastoralism. And unfortunately, that's a fact. In our sampling from the Demographic and Health Service, we only have 17 individuals for whom basically hunting, fishing, and gathering is the main activity. So these are the Mbuti in Congo, DRC. And so whenever you see now any correlations between hunting and fishing and gathering and economic performance, is not because we have any groups that are any chunk of individuals that are really hunter-gatherers in ancestry. It's really like a residual activity that you are mostly farmer in your ancestry, and you were doing a little bit of hunting on the side. So there is no, we don't really have contemporary descendants of hunting and gathering communities. Okay, now, so what we will be looking? We'll be looking at individuals that basically live in different, live outside their homelands. So what is the idea? The idea is that, say that you are running a regression and you are comparing the outcomes of the descendants of farmers versus the descendants of pastoralists at any place in a given country. Well, naturally, if the more fertile pockets of land have already become, which were farmers' pockets, have become now the cities of today, most likely you would say that, look, living in the more fertile places in Africa, which is more urbanized, is going to get you a lot of better economic outcomes. But then you would be conflating two things, whether it's the role of the region itself or it's something above and beyond the role of the geography of the place. So in order to focus on the portable and ethnic specific trait, we're going to exploit within village across ethnicity variation in pre-colonial economic traits. So we're going to be saying, look, we're going to look within the same village, within the same neighborhood in a given urban place. And this will allow us to compare basically individuals that in principle have access to the same school, have access to the same labor market, have access to the same opportunities, as long as these opportunities are space specific. Okay, just to get a bit more understanding of the data, basically about 40% of the respondents, they live within, they answered that today they are in this village, and this village is in the ancestral homeland of their ethnic identity. 9% live within 10 kilometers of their respective ethnic borders. So about 50%, roughly speaking, of individuals sampled today in 21 countries, they live in their ancestral homelands. Another 50% lives outside of their ancestral homelands. Given that we will be zooming in on the same exact village, so we'll basically have village fixed effects or enumeration area fixed effects, we're going to be exploiting variation among guys that no longer live in their ancestral homeland. We're going to call them movers. It's not exactly a good term because we don't really know whether they moved. We know that they are outside their ancestral homeland. Maybe they were born there, but for lack of a better word, we're going to basically keep them as mentioning them as movers. Okay, so that's going to be, in the next 2 minutes, I'm going to basically be asking the question, fine, is ethnic identity predictive of before going into basically the asking whether descent, ancestry, pastoral ancestry versus farmers' ancestry is predictive of incomes. Let's forget about it for a moment. Are differences in ethnic identity predictive of economic outcomes across individuals today in Africa? This is basically a question that can be easily answered in terms of R-squares. So what are we going to do? I'm going to show you basically a table that, let's take, for example, the first column. I'm looking at, education. So I'm looking at 285,000 individuals, and I'm just now adding fixed effects. Now the first column, the first row basically adds country fixed effects. So how much of the variation across individuals can be explained by where these individuals live? Well, not much, about 16%. How about if you add actually country ethnicity fixed effects? So adding the fact that someone lives in Kenya and is also a Kikuyu. How much does this explain? Well, now the R-squared jumps quite a bit. It goes to about 28%. Now, given that I will be looking at guys that have moved outside of their homelands, then I'm basically, what really is the change in the R-square that I'm exploiting is basically moving from regressions where I have country homeland fixed effects, which is basically regressions where I ask how much of the variation across individuals can be explained by the homeland they live in a given country. So where it is the homeland of the Luo versus the homeland of the Kikuyu versus the homeland of the Liwia. This is a healthy 30%. But now, conditional on this, what if I also know the ethnicity of the respondent? Well, that's going to increase the R-squared, the explanatory power, by about 2.5 percentage points for the case of education, about 4 percentage points for the case of wealth. And now if you look at movers, you will find similar increase in percentages. So again, to repeat here, how much extra I get to explain besides the location of the respondent in terms of the homeland of the respondent is about 3 to 4% if I get to know also his ethnic identity. So then I'm going to basically be telling you that part of this ethnic identity explanation comes from the variation in terms of the dependence of agriculture versus dependence of pastoralism of the ancestors of these guys. Okay. So that's the main empirical specification. I have basically individuals that, so this is individual I, the outcome is education or the level of wealth. He's, we ask him at some point during the survey, he basically self-identifies with ethnicity E, he lives in homeland H and in country C. And basically, our main variable of interest is basically this beta coefficient, which quantifies how much of an increase in your standards of living, education, or wealth comes from basically tracing your ancestry to groups that are mostly dependent on agriculture. So the default category, the missing category, is your dependence on pastoralism. So what is like the two things that are going to be important is that, so the most important one is that I will be able to add village or enumeration area fixed effects. So this is about 8,000 fixed effects. In each village, basically, we have about 25 respondents. Okay, so let me actually show you an example. Here is Zambia. We have dots, black dots are the villages, the enumeration areas. Let's move to the north of Zambia. We're going to find ourselves in the land of Tawa. Let's zoom in this village. In this village, actually, the surveyors got to talk to about 8 people, 10 people, and we basically have their ethnic identity. So the green guys are the Bemba. They are actually predominantly agricultural groups. The red guys are the Luba. They were not dependent on agriculture. They were deriving less than 40% from agriculture, and the count the individual they sampled was somewhere in between. How much is their education today? So they live in the same village in the border of Zambia, and it's clearly the case that the Bemba are actually, they have at least completed primary compared to the Luba, which actually have, consistently display lower education levels. No, so that's going to be, that's going to be the type of variation that we'll be exploiting, right? Country, ethnic homeland, and then village, and the village fixed effects are going to be telling you that, look, now you look within the same village, to the extent that in this village, everybody has access to the same labor market, to the same schooling, to the same infrastructure, to the same, all these location-specific characteristics are unlikely to be part of the explanation. Okay. Let me, no, actually that's the main table. So let me stay on this table for a minute. So about 300,000 individuals, first three columns, dependent variables education, next three columns, dependent variables wealth. Consistently you get that those that trace their ancestry to groups that were more dependent on agriculture, they are actually much more likely, significantly more likely to be educated and have higher wealth levels. Now, it's interesting that when I add this coordinate fixed effects is the village fixed effects. They are basically looking within the same villages, the pattern remains the same. Two observations here. You may be actually wondering, this gather, hunting, and fishing, is this a residual category that I was telling you about? This is going to come out often positive and significant, but again, I want to stress that this finding is not because hunter-gatherers individuals that trace their ancestry to hunter-gatherers, they are actually doing better. They are not. It's that we don't observe them. To make this even clearer, just like focus on, instead of like how much is the percentage of your group doing agriculture, doing pastoralism, doing hunting and gathering, just let's actually ask the question, do you come from a mostly agricultural group, from a mixed dependence group, or from a mostly hunting group? And that's like basically column 1 in this table. You can clearly see that those that are doing mostly hunting, or their ancestors were mostly hunters, they are actually doing much worse. Now, the problem is when actually, but these are again the 17 guys, Mbuti guys in a village in Congo. So so these guys disappear when we try to exploit within village variation. So that's kind of to make clear. So whenever you see the coefficient on hunting and gathering being positive, think of it as a residual, as like those guys that trace their ancestry to groups that they were doing, 3% more hunting and 5% fishing. So nothing about, mostly dependence. So they were mostly dependent on agriculture, doing a little bit more of other activities as well. Okay, now how about the coefficient estimates? So are these like sensible, like large numbers? Well, let's look at education, comparing within the same village, guys of the same age, of the same sex, of the same gender, and those who are actually coming from groups that are mostly agricultural versus mostly pastoral, they have about a year of education more. So this is a large number, particularly in the context of Africa, where the years of schooling for about the 90s was about 6 years of education. Okay, now you may start wondering, well, hold on, like where is this pattern coming from? Is this a uniform pattern? Is this specific to a given location or to a given occupation? Let me take the next few minutes to say that actually, no, this seems to be a relatively generalized finding. Let's do this. So let's now look at different occupations. So let's go to all those that are doing farming, and then, among those that today are doing farming, or they are in farming related, so they are in primary sector. Indeed, those that can trace their descent to farmers, they're doing better. Well, maybe you say, okay, that's not very surprising. Well, of course, if your great-grandfather was very good at farming, he was a farmer himself, 3 generations later, you will also be equally good at it or even better. So yeah, I buy that. Now, the thing that is actually a bit more interesting is that you can also look at, sectors that they are not doing farming. So these are all sectors like people that are in services, people that are in manufacturing. Still, those that say, look, I come from a group that is actually an agricultural group, I'm again systematically more likely to be more educated. And you can split this between urban and rural, and maybe, of course, within rural areas, perhaps farmers are better because they have more wealth, but actually even in urban areas, those that have traced their descent to farming groups, they register higher outcomes, both in terms of wealth and in terms of education. So it's not about occupational specialization, it's not about regional variation. In rural settings, in urban settings, within occupations, farmers, tracing your descent to a farmer society, to a farming community, does seem to come with better outcomes. Okay, now, again, I know I wish we were live so that I could take your questions immediately, because I know there were like lots of questions right now running through your head. And so let me try to intuitively go through those. So then you may ask the question, okay, is it really for every country in Africa, if you were to do this association, you would find a similar pattern? Well, not for every country, but for about 15 out of 20 countries, you would find a positive and significant association between dependence on agriculture, pre-colonial, ancestral dependence on agriculture, and economic performance today at the individual level within neighborhoods in urban places within rural Africa. Now you may immediately say, fine, I believe you. But I think that what drives this association is that farmers, it's selection. And, because you look at guys that have moved outside of their homeland, because you include these village fixed effects, so you cannot exploit variation within non-movers. Maybe somehow farmers were more selected to move out. So you actually, if you were to go into their homelands and compare farmers to pastoralists, maybe there is no difference there. So the difference only arises when you look at the selected sample of guys that live outside of their homelands. Well, that's not the case either. We can actually look at basically, is it this? Well, no, but let me finish my train of thought. You can actually look at non-movers and compare now economic outcomes, education, and wealth among those that never, that they are still living in their homelands. Here you cannot do actually any within variation, because these are, you have to compare basically outcomes of people that live in different homelands. You will still find the same basically quantitative estimates. How about if basically farmers are more likely to move, or pastoralists are more or less likely to move in life? Well, this is now your answer. We have, for a subset, for half of the respondents, we actually have the surveyors ask them whether you moved in life ever. You don't see any difference between basically those who trace their descent to agriculture, to farmers versus pastoralists. There is no differential propensity to move in life, at least in this sample. So selection does not seem to be something salient, at least the way we measure it. How about, do I want to do that? I think I have about 20 minutes. So, so what we could do, we could say, look, you can take an IV approach. Now, IVs are very problematic. And I know that, the exclusion restriction, we all know that is usually not easily satisfied. But what type of IV you would do in this case? Well, the type of IV you would do, you would say, look, maybe you have in mind that groups that, your ancestors were farmers, well, maybe they were just better guys. They are more technologically advanced. They were more forward looking. So they adopted agriculture. So it is nothing about agriculture per se. It is just that, back in time, agriculture was the key economic activity. Your group was basically had these whatever specific characteristics of being good at picking up, the modern economic activity of the time. In the 19th century, it was agriculture. They still do it today. That's why there's nothing about agriculture per se that drives economic outcomes. It's really these like deeply rooted differences between groups. One way to go about this is to say, well, maybe one could make this this extreme argument, but to the extent that dependence on agriculture, might be driven by the quality of the soil or where your ancestors were living. So basically, if you end up living in places that were more fertile, eventually you would do more agriculture. If you were living in places where more conducive to pastoralism, you would actually be a pastoral, a herder after all. And maybe, then we can get variation in land quality for agriculture among your ancestors to predict economic performance today. Of course, the first stage is strong. Agricultural groups in the 19th century were living in places that were of higher agricultural quality, and pastoral groups were living in places with lower agricultural quality. Nothing surprising here. So you have a strong first stage, and the second stage is actually it gives you similar coefficient estimates, actually a bit less, a bit smaller, but the patterns are there. Okay, now one more element. So what is this comparison that we're doing so far? We're saying those guys that trace their descent, their ancestry to groups that in the past were mostly farmers versus mostly pastoralists. So are you comparing very different groups? Are you comparing groups that were, wherever they are, they were speaking very different languages, or they were basically very far apart in terms of linguistic or cultural distance? Or your argument about this dependence on agriculture really operates even within more, let's say, homogeneous cultural entities? Well, I was surprised actually by the fact that you can actually add a bunch of different fixed effects. You can basically compare groups that are within the same linguistic family, compare groups that are within the same linguistic subfamily, or within the same ethnic cluster. So let me show you the ethnic cluster outcomes. So what basically we have for these 200 groups that you can trace your ancestry to, our respondents trace their ancestry to, we know, how close they are. So we have a bunch of groups that are Southwestern Bantu or Kenya Highland Bantu, and this would be, the Kikuyu would be, in this group. So now, if we throw these fixed effects into our regressions, we will be actually asking, look, within all those groups that are actually much more homogeneous in terms of many characteristics, that is, all those groups that belong to the the family of the Kenya Highland Bantu, does variation in how much each of those individual societies in the past derived from agriculture, that is this predictive of actually economic outcomes at the individual level today? And it is still the same. We're actually getting pretty much the same coefficient estimates, pretty sizable, and they don't seem to change a lot. So I have been playing with this data for a long time, and so so robust patterns, when you cut the same data set in many different ways, when something is survives and keeps on coming up with the same, let's say, intensity, makes me believe that there is something there. There is something really in the data that distinguishes, in terms of economic outcomes, those of pastoral descent versus those of agricultural descent. And now, it's for the next 15 minutes, I will try to convince you, or at least to suggest to you. I will never convince you because I'm convinced myself, but I'm going to go through a series of suggestive arguments that will basically making the following argument. So what is coming? What is really what does agricultural dependence drive? So let's start from a reverse chronological order. So first of all, why didn't I just focus on some other trait, right? So you could have focused, or someone else could have focused on political complexity, on occupational specialization. I mean, from the past. These are all basically traits that come from the ethnographic atlas. So these describe the social and economic characteristics of these communities, like in the 19th century. Or cultural traits, why not polygyny? Why not clans or stratification? Well, the reason we focused on the economic mode of subsistence is because, first of all, we thought that this is actually a super important element. You know, many people have made this point, like Diamond was one of the first to make this point about, you know, transition to agriculture and the rise of civilizations. So we thought that this is a natural question to see whether we can continue our exploration at the individual level instead of just the country or location level. Now, is any of these elements basically important, or is any of these elements that is masking the correlation or that is driving the correlation between farmers, you know, between pre-colonial dependence of farming and contemporary economic performance? Is it because that on average, you know, more politically complex groups, they were also more likely to be farmers and also are more educated today? And, you know, repeat this argument for any of these other characteristics. One thing to keep in mind is that for Africa, for the idiosyncratic reasons of African landscape, which I would be happy to go over in the Q&A session, the correlation between the mode of subsistence and the degree of political complexity, that is the degree of political centralization, think of it as the presence of kingdoms, roughly speaking, is zero. So there is no relationship between pastoral or farmer dependence and the degree of political complexity. Happy to go over it in the Q&A, but for now, I take it as a fact of the African landscape. So what I'm going to show you now, I'm going to show you that actually, again, you know, there is no smoking gun here. So I'm going to show basically this table that above the line, I have the correlation, the association that I have shown you so far. How does dependence on agriculture of your ancestors correlate, predict higher education today? Now, in the below the line, it is exactly the same sample, but now I add one more pre-colonial characteristic at the time. So I control for the polygyny of the group, and I see how my coefficient changes as I go, as basically I add one more trait at a time. So the coefficients that you need to be comparing is the coefficient like 0.0709 to 0.0794. So it tells me how much the coefficient changed by adding one thing at a time. Polygyny, clans, settlement patterns, jurisdictional hierarchy, elections, slavery, property, all these elements together. What is surprising again is that the pattern of the predictive power of dependence on agriculture on education is remarkably robust. Basically, even at the end, when you throw everything together and your sample now drops quite a bit, it drops about 40%, the same coefficient estimate remains there. What is a new finding that we don't stress, but maybe we should? Those that were practicing groups belonging to groups that in the pre-colonial era, they had institutionalized slavery. Now it's unclear how much of this slavery was actually an outcome or an effect of the slave trades through Europeans. So this is indigenous slavery. These guys are underperforming in terms of education today. Okay, so in some sense, among pre-colonial features, one of the biggest or the most robust correlate is actually your ancestral dependence on farming versus pastoralism. Okay, now, you know, maybe, you know, the farmers were, these farming communities, the farming societies, they were basically privileged by the Europeans. So the Europeans arrived during the colonial era, and maybe they are lavishing them with public goods, with schools, with roads, and, you know, maybe that's what drives the association. They get access to missions and missionary schools, particularly the Protestant ones, might have given them access to education and hence a head start into educational attainment and hence more higher wealth levels today in 2010. So what I'm going to say, I'm going to basically do the same exercise. I'm going to take my benchmark specification and I'm going to add now different colonial controls. So I'm thinking of colonial controls as European interventions. So how many slaves did your homeland lose during the slave raids? How many Christians and Muslims are there? I'm thinking of these as catch-all variables that give me some variation into the intervention of Europeans or exposure to Europeans or non-Europeans during the colonial era. How about, you know, how many Christian missions you got as a group back in time? Well, Each of those may have some explanatory power, particularly, you know, installing Christian missions. You know, if your homeland got more Christian missions in the past, you seem to have higher wealth or more education today. But it still is important to keep in mind that the coefficient estimates in terms of education and in terms of you know, wealth level, they remain basically precisely estimated. Okay, so it's not, or at least it's not crying out loud that there is something about the colonial intervention, that it was totally lopsided in a way that the data, you know, or at least if it was, we do not have the correct measures to get these colonial interventions. Okay, in the last 9 minutes, basically. In the last 9 minutes, I'm going to tell you what is a potential channel. So one of the narratives among basically social psychologists so is that, you know, the main notion is that the environment, you live in a given environment, the given environment produces challenges, you are shaping best responses to these challenges, and then through these best responses, you are passing them intergenerationally, and so this creates culture. This creates basically, you know, this best response is culture, is like beliefs and attitudes of how you should respond in given settings. And this type of analysis tells you that, look, then even when the initial environment disappears and there's a new environment, still your best response, your ingrained cultural elements stay with you, and that makes you either better suited or worse suited to the new environment. Okay, so what are the hypotheses that have been, you know, aired? So you know, people have been saying that farmers acclimate, because of their type of activity, acclimate to more sustained and repetitive labor compared to herders. They have to live in closer proximity to one another, again, compared to the more sparsely populated pastoral areas. Now, one which is particularly interesting, and I'll show you something along these lines, is this idea of herders being ready to exact revenge on others. And why is that? The idea is kind of interesting. It says, look, assets, the main asset of a herding community is mobile, which means that you can basically very quickly lose your assets and go from a rich person to a pauper within minutes, which means that, you know, in an environment that is weakly institutionalized, the way to make sure that no one will come and steal the herd from you is to have a persona or an identity that is ready to exact violence, revenge, retaliation. And the narrative goes that, look, you were like hundreds of years being under this environment. If you find yourself in a modern environment, in an urban setting, well, if you still have this kind of instincts of immediate engagement, and you know, this goes for all types of attitudes, this would make you less likely to be a successful, let's say, guy in an urban sector today. Okay, now, can we measure those? Well, here's an attempt. So here's the attempt. The first thing is from the Demographic and Health Service, where we have some idea of whether, from the same data set, then we can ask people whether, you know, what is your proclivity to violence? Now, you see, there is not exactly a question that goes exactly to violence. It is a question that combines treatment towards women and proclivity to violence. So the exact question is how, you know, under which conditions you would find justifiable, acceptable for a man to beat his wife. And then, you know, there's a bunch of scenarios that are being narrated or are being described to the respondent, and the respondent says, I find it acceptable or less acceptable or not at all acceptable. What we can see, actually, we can see that those that trace their ancestry to farming groups, they are much less likely to basically say, I find it acceptable to beat one's wife. Now you may say, is this about the role of women, or it is about the proclivity towards violence? Well, for the role of women, we can actually look whether there is a gender gap in education in the pastoral households versus the agricultural households. And there is no such gender gap. Pastoral groups, in pastoral groups, both males and females are actually equally, well, no, in the respondents that trace their ancestry to pastoral groups, their offspring, male and female, they're equally less educated. So there's no differential gender gap between farmers and those that raise their ancestry to farming communities versus herding communities. Okay. Now, is there any other way that we can go a little bit closer to these elements of culture? Well, here are two things. We move to another data set, this is the Afrobarometer data set, where we move there because it has quite a bit of information on beliefs and attitudes. Particularly, what we actually have, we have something that I have not seen many people using it, maybe for a reason. We have basically how the interviewer feels that his interviewee, his respondent, behaves during the interview. So, you know, every interviewer who would go in the village would basically interview about 10, 15 people. And then, you know, we would have in the survey the answers of the respondent himself, but also the answers, some answers of the interviewer regarding some of the characteristics or how he perceived his respondent to be. So what we actually have questions about, you know, did you feel, you know, forget about column 1, focus now on columns 2 to 7. We have basically questions that the interviewer is answering regarding, you know, did you feel that the respondent is hostile? Did you feel that the respondent is bored? Did you feel that he's non-cooperative, that he's impatient, that he's suspicious or dishonest? Systematically, within the same village, within the same interviewer, if the other party is more dependent on traces and ancestry to pastoralism, he would be more likely to be bored during the interview, non-cooperative, showing signs of impatience, according to the interviewer himself at least, being suspicious or more dishonest. Again, here, we cannot really be sure whether maybe the interviewer is biased and is biased against those with a pastoral descent. Now, you know, the caveat here is how would he know exactly whether the other guy, you know, in front of him is from pastoral descent, but be that as it may. But that's, you know, some evidence consistent that these guys, they seem to be perceived differently in terms of their, you know, soft social attitudes. Now, at the same time, and I would be clear here, these respondents, now it's not the interviewer anymore, it's the respondent himself. These respondents would feel actually that their group, pastoral, you know, those that trace their descent to pastoral groups, they would feel that they are really having very little political influence. So here we get the perceptions are very clear that those of pastoral descent, they feel that their group are getting in the political arena the wrong end of the stick. Let me basically now move to two more observations, and I'll open the floor to discussion. So the first observation is, okay, can we give a little bit more credence to the idea that pastoral societies had developed this culture of honor that may be, you know, relevant for understanding their variation in you know, this prosocial attitudes to today. Well, here I'm drawing this picture. It draws from a project on the folklore that I've been working on the last few months, and really, you know, it's really telling you the following. If you look at the oral tradition of pastoral groups, this is now for the whole world, but I can replicate, I did just replicated actually the picture for you today. In Africa, pastoral groups in Africa, they're systematically more likely to have in the oral tradition narratives and stories that portray someone taking revenge, someone taking retaliation, someone being angry and taking revenge and retaliation against some other you know, individual. So again, this is again suggestive evidence that pre-colonial lifeways might have shaped the way that people are you know, through these narratives, they may, continue having different attitudes. Again, this is just speculative and suggestive, I understand, but I thought it was relevant to show it to you today. The last bit is actually, again, derived from a totally different data set. These are, looking at intergenerational mobility in Africa. And this is when I really got convinced that there is something going on with pastoralists versus agriculturalists. So what is the setting? The setting is all censuses from 30 countries in Africa. We are looking at children born to illiterate parents. So the setting is the initial illiteracy that dominates an African household in the 60s. We're asking the question, what is the probability that the child born to illiterate parents is actually going to complete primary? So that's our measure of intergenerational mobility. What you actually see in the data, and then you ask, in this graph I'm asking the question, well, I know the ethnic identity of the household, so I can actually say which groups are more intergenerationally mobile. We're getting this, when I found this, because this comes from a totally different project with a totally different question, and we got this pattern again, that across Africa, 30 countries in Africa, ethnicities, individuals that trace their ancestry to pastoral group, they register much lower intergenerational mobility compared to individuals that trace their ancestry to basically agricultural groups. So this also tells me that this gap that we observe in terms of educational wealth between farmers, between those of farming descent and herding descent, is not a handicap of the past. It's not that back in time the farmers were much more educated or much more wealthy compared to pastoralists. This gap is widening, intergenerational mobility between basically the 60s and the 90s is widening as we speak. This is again consistent with an idea that the ancestral environments are shaping best responses, which makes these communities make the best of the underlying resources. But once you go out of this environment, urban Africa, these legacies now may become deleterious, may become a handicap for subsequent for individual economic performance. So again, these I'm out of time and I'm going to stop now basically, but these findings together make me, make me confident that there is something going on here, and probably cultural and political aspects are at play. And for sure, I'm going to learn more from your answers, and more work on channels are needed desperately. And yeah, that's about it.
Thank you, Stylianos. I know many people have been waiting anxiously to ask you questions and make comments. I just have a couple of quick questions. One is ancestor worshiping by a group or within a group in pre-colonial days. Would that have any bearing on the key outcome variables you're focusing on? And secondly, for some groups, I imagine trading or traders may have had some relatively high representation among the group's population in pre-colonial days. I know for many of the landlocked areas or areas without much transportation infrastructure, trading may not have been a big part of their economic activity. But I guess for some groups, they may have developed some dependence on trading as a way of living in pre-colonial days. Will you have data on that? And then would that also have some effect on the outcome variables?
That's interesting. So let me start from the second. One of the big missing items from the ethnographic atlas is actually the trade dependence. So they would not be, the ethnographers at that point in time, they were not trade economists. So trade would not did not appear in their compendium, basically. Now, anecdotally, the role of trade in Africa is a complex question. Why? Because oftentimes trade involved slavery. Trade involved the enslaving of populations. So there, the legacy of trade itself can basically have conflicting kind of contemporary influences, having, and given that trade in slave trade took place along pre-existing trade routes. They did not invent new trade routes. They basically tag along the old trade routes, which means that is an excellent question. The data is not there yet. Hopefully, through the data on folklore that we are working these days, we'll be able to say something about communities that actually have in their narrative stories about exchange, trade, the prices, gold, silver, and things like that. For today, it will be remain a big unknown. The second bit about ancestral worshipping, it's what do you think you would be capturing with that? You would be capturing something about how tightly knit, how backward looking is this?
I was thinking, yeah, I was thinking that that may have some bearing or some impact on the clan solidarity or lineage formation, because just like in China, ancestor worshiping emerged and developed as a way to make the solidarity among clan members more solid. And then the risk sharing and intertemporal commitment would be done, or be achieved with more security. But I guess, of course, that's in some way an indicator of the level of social development in a given group. So if the social development was higher in the pre-colonial days, then that group may actually encourage education or may negatively affect education. I don't know which way it would go, because the Chinese experience would be then more members out of a lineage would be sent to school for this.
Right. So that's it's a great question. The answer is that to the extent, if it was something that was correlated, for example, with the clan structure of the community, then I can tell you that at least the way it is measured in the ethnographic atlas, it does not show up to be very predictive of contemporary outcomes. But it leaves open the question of, how can we measure social capital in the pre-colonial era? And again, I think the way to measure it is to look at narratives. This would be a way that you could actually say, look, do they talk a lot about the extended family, or it's all about different stories where grandmother and grandfather and ancestors are never mentioned, so you are in a very different type of society. So in some sense, you are asking questions that we hope to be able to answer in the coming years than being able to tell you today yes or no.
Yeah, thank you. Let me turn it over to my colleagues, Professor Zhichen Ma, who is here at the Faculty of Business and Economics at Hong Kong U, and also Professor He-Wai Tan, Professor of Economics here at Hong Kong U. Do you have any questions? And then we can turn it over to the audience.
Zhichen, you should go first.
Okay.
You are on this area.
Hey, Stylianos.
Hey.
I'm just wondering, within the agriculture group, is there any difference in their agriculture pattern? For example, the group focusing on the staple crop planting versus those planting economic groups, whether or not there's some difference in terms of their long-term impact on their descendants' education and wealth.
Good question. So one of the things that we did check, and thankfully the ethnographic atlas was there to answer, is the extent of extensive versus intensive agriculture. So whether we're really comparing, agriculturalists that would move every few years because they would let their lands go fallow, they would basically do shifting agriculture versus those that were doing more intensive agriculture. We were expecting, given the hypothesis, to find that the intensive agriculturalists would be there would be a gradient even within agriculture, with those that are doing more intensive agriculture, benefiting more or registering better outcomes. We did not find that. And again, it is to keep in mind, there is this peculiar landscape in Africa where the tsetse fly really determines quite a bit of the location of where you will have extensive versus intensive agriculture. So there are like lots of geographic elements that go into this calculation. In the end of the day, the data do not support in Africa a clear distinction in terms of contemporary outcomes among those of descent, intensive descent, or extensive descent, or those that were doing mostly cereals versus other non-cereal cultivation.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Should I jump in? All right, Stylianos, great talk. It reminded me of one of the talks that you gave 10 years ago at Tufts. Every time I had some questions, I had to cross it out because immediately in the next regression table you answered.
Okay.
So, I mean, you did a lot of robustness checks to basically exclude, all sort of potential reasons for why agricultural ancestry matters. But I think at the end, you were absolutely right that, we are still sort of lacking understanding through what channels that agriculture affects today's economic behavior. I think one potential direction that we can think about is, what shapes saving behavior, right? Now living in Asia, I realize that, economists are still sort of lack of understanding about why, Asians in general tend to save more compared to Westerners. And I think, when we think about sort of agricultural activities versus other kind of, historical activities, one thing is, I was surprised that Julian emphasized this more in his comments, which is attitudes towards risk, right? So, when you're doing hunting, you're exposed to risk every day. And there's very limited scope for you to diversify away from risk, right? You just have to deal with the nature. But once you're in farming, you feel like, you have more handling of the situation, right? So, I don't know whether DHS has some questions about risks. Maybe that is the direction to think about. The other is about, what drives sort of the perspective about the future, right? So remember, there's a paper by Keith Chang in AER talking about, how the linguistic structure of different languages essentially shape people expectations about the future and therefore affects their saving behavior. One regression that you ran, which caught my eyes, is whether the respondent is being impatient, and you figure out that people with ancestors that are doing agriculture tend to be more patient. And along that line, could we push more to think about why agricultural activities will affect people expectation about the future, and essentially induce them to be more patient, to be more forward-looking, and therefore incentivize them to invest more in education as well as financial assets.
Thank you. Hey, wait, this was actually very good. It was my bad that I did not mention that actually there is a paper by my colleague Odette Galor and Omer Ozak that they are actually showing that higher suitability for land for agriculture does predict patience today. And the idea is that if you need to basically store your seeds in advance in order to get them for the next year going. So this kind of formation of forward-looking behavior, which they show to be linked to basically the quality of land, the type of crops that, you know, some you need to plant much more in advance versus others. They have a very nice paper where they actually had this very robust link between, you know, patience today and variation in land quality in agriculture across different countries. But so I think that this is a key mechanism for sure. The value added of this paper is to say that you can look at the same guys with the same ethnic, with the same national identity. They live in the same neighborhood in Lagos, and you know this trace of where actually their ethnic identity can be traced to is consequential for actually differences in outcomes today. And I think, you know, that's, but you're right that much more work needs to be done. The patience part is important. And this last bit that I showed you, that basically intergenerational mobility today is actually higher among these, the descendants of farmers versus the descendants of pastoralists, tell me that it is not something that happened in the past. It is not like some discrimination story that, you know, back in the early 19th century, farmers got it all and herders got nothing, and then you have a percolation of adverse initial conditions. Because you can actually see it even today, being born to illiterate people, equally illiterate parents, those of farmers descent within the same neighborhood will be more likely to get primary going, which is, and it's not labor, it cannot be exactly labor market outcomes. If you look very locally, unless you start thinking about networks and maybe farmers are going to discriminate. So there is very hard to distinguish also this element of, you know, maybe there's some ongoing discrimination which fits back into why they do not accumulate human capital and they fall behind. And I think that, you know, more work is needed to tell apart, you know, kind of the external influence. They're being discriminated and they fall behind, or the internal drive. They have different best responses, which are less suitable for a modern setting, at least the very first decade of the modern setting in Africa.
Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so now let me give Professor Campbell of the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology a chance to speak. He has been waiting for a long time to ask you something. Or to
Sure.
Okay. Well, my question is pretty quick. It's mainly a data question, actually, which is really, you know, how should we think about self-reported ethnicity in an African context, in the sense that we have examples from a lot of other settings where people that are upwardly mobile will often find ways to sort of upgrade their ancestry as well, like we, during the 19th century, former Nobi in Korea would pay to have themselves added to the genealogies of Yangban families, and you know, there's lots of examples like that. Should we, in the context of Africa, is ethnicity fluid enough that people, especially if they had the chance to migrate and kind of start a new life, would they sort of upgrade their reported ancestry to affiliate with maybe what they thought was a higher status group or something like that? I don't really know anything about Africa, so I have no, you know, no idea, you know. But that's my question.
It's a very good question, Cameron. Thanks. I have been asking this myself. I've been asking myself, how sticky is this identity? It's predictive for sure, but is it sticky? Is it something that was there like 50 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago? And I don't really know. This upgrading or changing identity, you know, the only way that we could sensibly go about it is if you were to have panel data, repeated cross-sections of the same individuals, asking them at different points in time. I'm not aware of this data in the context of Africa. I am aware of narratives that people, you know, that they might, so I had a project that, for example, I was trying to get at this by doing the following. I was trying to basically look at look at couples in Africa from census that they come from different ethnicities. What type of identity will actually the daughter or the son will adopt? Because he would have a choice of two identities or a third one. And then I'm still struggling to basically finish this project, but this would be one way to get at this question. For sure, there is not much variation. That is, there are very few couples that are hetero of different ethnic group, and usually there would be very strong matrilineality component. If you are if you belong to a matrilineal group, then the offspring would assume the identity of the mother. If you are a patrilineal group, there is deviations, don't get me wrong, but the patterns at the first pass are very stark, that there is like conformism. I'm not saying that there is no deviations, I'm saying that we have not measured them in a systematic way yet. And thank you for this question, actually. I need to go back to this project and get an answer.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, here we have a question from, I don't know his true name, but from Propulsion. He asks, do you think this research could be considered when governments make public policy decisions? It might be more of an ethics question, but if we are quite confident that agricultural ancestry influences the modern economic performance of different groups, should policies intentionally favor these groups that are disadvantaged, so to speak?
That's a difficult question.
I thought usually the groups with agricultural background are more disadvantaged than instead of the other way around.
You mean compared to groups of what? Of what?
With industrial, oh, that's more recent, I guess.
Right. So yes, I guess it's the comparison of the modern sector of the past. Let's say is agriculture. But not to the specific question, it really depends, right? What are governments trying to maximize? If they are maximizing equity, then clearly we have something predictive of inequality, then they should try to address it. If equity is the outcome of interest. Now, I think, but before answering this, I think that much more work needs to be done to understand the channels. Are the channels structural, or are the channels, softer, like cultural? Because that would also imply very different interventions. Maybe not building schools, but building role models in different communities. So before jumping into governments doing things, I think we as academics, myself in particular, should do much more work to better understand what is exactly at play before jumping the gun towards policy recommendation.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. So does anyone else have any comment or question? No? Okay.
I have one more.
Okay.
Stylianos, have you thought about this cultural diffusion? Because you have very geographically disaggregated information. Do people who interact with traits that came with a cultural ancestry tend to change their behavior as well?
Repeat, did not get it.
So, suppose you have two different groups interacting in the same village, one with, agricultural ancestry and one without. Would the group without agricultural ancestry tend to converge to the behavior of those that had? So basically, it's a cultural diffusion idea within a very close geographic setting.
I guess the way to look at this would be to look at different cohorts, but then see whether initial conditions are converging or are stable or are diverging, looking at subsequent generations, right? Those that are born in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And if anything, the intergenerational mobility results are giving me, at least in the short run being the few decades after independence, if anything, the dynamics are divergent instead of convergent in terms at least of educational acquisition. But nothing about beliefs. I don't know about beliefs. Then we don't have so rich data to think about cultural attitudes. You can measure better educational attainment for different cohorts back in time, but for you know, attitudes, softer things, we are kind of constrained. But I see what you would like, where you would like to go. Like, do I see a concomitant divergence in beliefs, stability in belief, in gaps in beliefs? How do the gaps in beliefs behave over time?
Right, exactly, yeah. Because there's this assimilation of immigrants literature, looking at the saving behavior of, let's say, Chinese immigrants in the US, right? So I think the saving behavior didn't last for more than 2 generations. You know, it's all the first generation immigrants that still continue that habit. I mean, may not be that related, but I think you have the right setting to look at a very similar situation.
Got you. Thanks, AY.
Yeah.
Thank you, Stylianos. I know this is very late for you. It's 10:30 p.m. Where you live. So we are really grateful for you doing the presentation for us. I also want to thank the audience for taking out the time and join our discussion and the presentation here. Before we finish here, let me also announce the upcoming seminar next week, precisely a week from today on May 7th. Next time, there will be a slight change in the sense that it will be, the seminar will be in Mandarin Chinese, and then Professor Liu Guangling, our favorite historian at Nanyang University, will present his recent research. So please join us next week. And then again, if you have not subscribed or signed up to our mailing list, please do so by scanning the QR code on your screen, and so that we can send you, you know, more information as our future seminars are scheduled and so on. Again, thank you everyone for joining us, and in particular, our thanks go to Professor Michalopoulos, and we wish you a good night. Thank you again. Thanks to everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a great night, everybody. Pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Great to see you. Great talk.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Yeah, take care.
Take care.